These are the live internet studies brought to you week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. Let's talk about Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 17, where we're having this discussion about Judaism versus Christianity, or are Judaism and Christianity incompatible with one another? That's really the question on the table before us tonight. So let's jump right back into our study where we left off. What I want to do is, as mentioned last week, I want to read this passage that we've been borrowing out of Matthew about the three parts to this parable, about fasting at a wedding, about patching up an old cloth, an old garment, and pouring new wine into old wineskins. That's how it shows up in Matthew. What I want to do is actually read the Luke rendering, because there's some extra details that show up in this story. In fact, there's actually a fourth parable, or a fourth anecdote that Yeshua uses that shows up in the Luke version. The Mark story is similar to Matthew. It only has three elements like A, B, C. But the Luke version has four, A, B, C, D. So let's read the Luke version and kind of work with that for a moment. So this is ESV in front of you on your screen right now. Let me just read verses 33 through verse 39. And they said to him, disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. Verse 34. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come, starting verse 35, when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. Verse 36. He also told them a parable. And we see this is in the Luke account is where the word parable actually shows up in regards to the cloth and the wine skin, things like that. Versus Matthew doesn't say anything about a parable. So, verse 36, he told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Notice in this version, it's not like you go out and buy a new patch, like maybe Matthew implies. But here in Luke, you actually take a piece from an existing new garment, and you're going to patch up an old garment with that new piece. But it doesn't matter about that extra detail, because the application is still the same. Yeshua continues, he says, if he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. So you end up with two garments that are ruined. You have an old new garment that you rip the patch out of, and you're going to sew it to the old batch, and they're not going to match up. Notice he doesn't say anything about washing or anything like that. If the shrinking patch, the part that Matthew talks about, he's simply still using similar analogy or parable, common sense factor going on to introduce that there's some incompatibility between old and new items. That's really the central point, I believe, of his analogy. And there, in verse 37, he jumps into the second the third of three elements to the story. The first would have been the wedding feast. The second is the garment. The third now is this wine. He says in verse 37, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. This one sounds very close to Matthew's rendering. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. So again, kind of working from the common sense factor of old and new and the incompatibilities between the two if you simply just thrust the two together without any other conditioning or factors that take place. And then here in the Luke rendering, by way of interest, after he continues in verse 38, he says, but new wine must be put into fresh wineskins, which is the closing clause of the third element. He introduces this fourth kind of common sense anecdote or parable that Matthew leaves out. I can't remember if Mark includes this fourth element. I don't remember that he does. We can go look at that next week. But notice that Yeshua says in verse 39, and no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. End. Now, we talked last week about how there's basically two general ways to view this story here in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We could either go the route of the allegory, where we take the elements of the story, we treat the parable as if it's teaching a spiritual lesson that's greater than the elements themselves. And so when we go into allegory or homily or some type of midrash or something like that, it's not necessary to take all of the elements of the parable and make them have a one-to-one corresponding assigning role. Rather, we're working from the general spiritual application, the greater, in other words, the thrust behind Yeshua's words of using the parable. So in the allegory, the main point of all of the elements seems to be that there's an old way of doing things and a new way of doing things. And in this story, old and new sometimes clash, and it's necessary to make a choice between one or the other.